everyone, welcome back to the channel. Hope everyone is doing well out there. As you can see next to me, I have the Queen Studios Life-Size Venom Bust by Marvel Comics. If you've been following the social media channels, you probably came across this statue maybe once, twice, maybe a dozen times. Unfortunately, this statue was plagued with quality control issues. The statue was limited to only 576 pieces made. And personally, myself, I've seen now close to 100 that are being repaired. So it's a vast majority of them that are having QC issues. So now the issues are happening in the mouth area, specifically the jawline. Right in the center here, they're cracking open, they're flaking. It's just breaking open, looking like the mouth is falling off. I've seen it so bad to where the lower jaw, right around the gum line, that was breaking open. Luckily, this one here isn't as bad. It's only having the issues right in the center of the jawline. So in today's video, I'll be going in, patching it up, factory matching the paint back to new. Because it is a Venom statue, he does have a lot of saliva in the mouth. So they had used a thick, clear epoxy resin. I might need to go back and add that in. I'm not sure yet. We'll see. But yeah, we're going to be working on this guy in today's video. So let's get started. All right, and here we go, the Queen Studios Life-Size Venom Bust. Here's an overall look at what I'm working on today. It's a really nice looking statue. Really love all the texture within the body. It's painted black, but there's a lot of blue highlights. Here's a look at the mouth area. If you look closely, you're going to see all of that clear epoxy resin that I was talking about, especially dripping off the teeth. It's a really cool looking effect. Just a really cool looking statue in general, and the mouth area of this statue really shines and has such an amazing presence to it. So going into the mouth area, you're going to notice the damage on the left and on the right side. Here's a look at the left. It's already cracking and the paint is flaking off. That piece right there kind of looks like it's ready to fall off, so I'll have to go in and take a look at that. There's some seam lines within the jawline itself. I might go in and fix those as well and patch those up. Here's a look at the right side. It's not as bad as the left, but there's definitely two little small breaks there, and the paint is flaking off there as well. Here's a look at the center keyhole on the bottom of the jaw. That's where the tongue keys in. The entire mouth has a lot of gaps within the inside of it. I'm assuming they constructed this in several different pieces to get it all together, and that's just what they had to do. And perhaps the lower jaw wasn't attached correctly on these statues, and they're shifting and cracking and breaking. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to do is go around and buff up the area with some 800 grit sandpaper. I want to go into the damage area and make sure I remove any paint that's flaking off. Also, any areas that might be chipping or breaking, I want to make sure nothing is loose before I go in there and resculpt over it. I want to have a nice clean area that's properly prepared. I don't want to just go in and patch over this and then worry about my patch failing in the future. The second thing I'm doing with the sandpaper is they used a really high gloss clear coat on the mouth to get that wet look. So when I have to go back later on and paint this, it's not so easy painting over something that was clear coated in a high gloss. Paint actually has a tough time sticking to a high gloss clear coat. So I'm just going around and buffing the area and removing that top layer of clear coat. This way I have a better surface when I go back later and prime and paint this. Also, it'll give me a better surface area for the epoxy to adhere to. So I'm just going around all the areas that I'll be going in and filling with epoxy, as well as the areas I plan on painting over later on, and scuffing it up and getting it ready. So I'm using 800 grit sandpaper on a sponge. The sponge allows me to go around and make sure I don't sand anything too flat. The sponge adheres to the surface and the curves, so that's why I'm using a sponge for this, as it gives me better control. So now that I finished my surface preparation and removed any paint that was flaking, I'm just using the airbrush gun as an air compressor and going around and just blowing off the dust with it before I go in and add my epoxy sculpt. This way I have a nice clean surface to work on. And now I'm going in with some alcohol wipes and just further cleaning the area and getting it ready for prep. And here's how that's looking so far. You'll see that the area now is scuffed up. And looking at that piece on the left, it looks like it's ready to fall off. So I will be going in and taking a look at that again. There's a look at that giant seam line. And another look at the right side, which isn't as bad as the left side. But yeah, I smoothed out the paint as best as I could. This way I know it's not going to flake off in the future. So I'm going in with my sculpting tool. I was doing one last final check on the areas to make sure I removed all the damage. And I noticed there was some movement with that piece you're looking at right now. Kind of had some give to it. It was moving up and down. And I just don't feel comfortable patching right over it and then having that fall off and mess up my patch in the future. So it looks like it's about to fall off, so I'm just going to carefully go in and remove this section here. And as I suspected, it wasn't too hard to remove, so it's good that I went back and did one last final check and removed this piece. Which now leaves me with more work to do, but it was better to remove it now than worry about that failing in the future. Okay, so everything is looking good. I went around and sanded down all the areas of damage, made sure all the loose debris was removed. It's now ready to go in and go back and add my epoxy sculpt, patch up all those seam lines and resculpt this area and make it look new again. So I'm using my 2-part epoxy sculpt, mixing 2 halves together to form my clay compound. And I'll be using this to patch up the areas of damage and to resculpt any missing pieces. So I'll be going around with the epoxy sculpt and packing it into areas where the gaps are, making sure it's packed in nice and tight, and this way there won't be any further movement from this jawline in the future. My plan for adding the epoxy sculpt is to run it up the inner cheek and blend it in. This way it has a smoother blend and it hides better than just jamming some epoxy sculpt into the hole and covering it up. This will give it a nice cleaner look overall. And like I mentioned, it'll blend seamlessly together and look like nothing was ever done to it. It's a little bit more extra work to have to go and do all this, but the final result will look cleaner than just smashing some epoxy sculpt into the hole and painting over it. So at this point, the epoxy sculpt is about halfway cured, and I'm going around with my paintbrush and smoothing out the sculpt and further blending it upwards into the inner cheek line. And even though you don't see the inside of the jaw, once the tongue gets keyed in, it kind of hides all this. I am going to go the extra step and pack in this gap to strengthen the lower jaw from shifting again in the future. So I'm going around using my sculpting tools and packing it in there and working my way around to get a nice smooth finish. The more time I take doing a cleaner sculpt, the less time it'll take for me to have to go back and sand this all down and try to fix it and make it smoother. So I tend to spend more time with the sculpt and make sure it's nice and smooth and clean looking than just laying it on thick and then going back later and trying to sand it all down later on. And once again, going around with my brush and smoothing out the area. Here's another angle so you can see what I'm doing. If you look at the mouth area, you'll see I'm blending the epoxy upwards inside the inside of the cheek. This way, when I go back later on and paint it, it'll all be hidden and you won't even notice it's there. So here's a look at the first stage of the epoxy sculpt. Went around and tried to get it as clean as possible and blended it as clean as possible as well. I'm gonna let this cure overnight and go back tomorrow and do a little bit of sanding and further smooth it out. All right, so it's the next day. I went around and I did a little light sanding. It was pretty good overall. It looks messy, but I really didn't have to do too much sanding. I just smoothed out a lot of the areas and made sure everything was nice and flush. This way, when I go in with the paint, it'll be nice and clean looking. All right, and the next step is going to be to put on the primer before the paint. So I'm using a gray surface primer and going around and painting over the epoxy sculpt. I'm also feathering it out a little bit. This way, when I go back with the paint, it'll blend in nice and smoothly. And here's how it's looking after the primer. The next step is going to be to mix up the base coat and get this ready for paint. Alright, so I'm mixing up my base coat. It's going to be the color that they used on the bottom of the jaw. It's like a pinkish peach orange color. So I'm going to do some tests and try to get it as close as possible. So here's my first test. It's looking a little bit bright at the moment. The paint does still need to dry a little bit. Paint always dries darker. So I went back and adjusted the color a little bit. And now I'm going in and laying down my base coat. After that, I can go back in and add the brighter pinks and the reds. And they actually added a little bit of like a yellow mustard color. If you look later on at the top of the inner cheek, you'll notice all the different colors that they used. All right, and here's the final look of just the base coat. It matches up pretty close, I think. If you're looking just at the bottom where the tongue keys in, that's all I'm worried about right now is matching that color. And then next, we'll be going in and painting that inner cheek with all the brighter colors. So as mentioned, if you look at the top of the jaw, they did use a yellow mustard color. So I'm going to be using a combination of different pinks, different reds, and different oranges and yellows, and going around and blending it all together to blend it back into the factory paint color. So there's a look at the yellow being put in. Next up, I'm going around and adding back some of the pink. And going back in and adding the reds and doing some shading with the darker red colors. So here's how the inside of the cheek is currently looking. And here's an overall finished look of the mouth all painted before it gets clear coated. The clear coat, once I gloss it, is what's going to bring this all to life and make it look all wet and slimy and make it look like saliva is dripping inside the mouth, as well as the clear epoxy that I'll add later on. So the next step is to add the clear coat. Okay, and here's a look at the clear coat after it was applied. As you can see now, it's a huge difference. It really brings out all the colors and ties everything together. If you look at the inside of the cheek, you have those mustard orange colors, the pinks, the reds. It all blends in nice and seamlessly with the rest of the mouth with the factory paint. So I'm really happy with the results. And the final step is to go back in and add some of the saliva effects using the clear epoxy resin. So I'm going to be going around with some clear epoxy resin and dripping it over the gum line and building up that really thick saliva look and adding some drip marks in certain places. Okay, and I think we're just about ready to take a look at the final results. As always, feel free to leave a comment below. I always appreciate the feedback. Please leave the video a like. Feel free to subscribe to the channel. It keeps me motivated to continue making these types of videos. As always, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next project, and here's the final result.